the Constitution in South Africa talks about the separation of powers, and that is the judiciary, the legislature, and the executive. And that in a constitutional democracy, each of these arms of the state should operate within the allocated sphere and not encroach onto any sphere allocated to others. That's really the essence.
But is there an indication that there's an encroachment, or are courts in this country doing their job?
I think our courts in the main are doing their job. And there are instances of failure which raises the concerns that some of us are expressing. Basically, that's what it is.
Tell us about those instances.
When the court takes the role of being the legislature, for instance, in the case that involved the scorpions, the court went beyond, in my view, the parameters agreed or allocated by the Constitution. Here you had a situation where the legislature passed a law which was valid, and in striking down that law, the courts came to a conclusion that it was unconstitutional, which is within its mandate. But to go beyond that point and then assume the role of a legislature by saying that this law must be replaced by such and such and such a law. For instance, the essence of that decision was that an independent investigating body should be created along the same lines as the law that was repealed by the legislature previously. Now, that is a legislative function. Now,
I'm going to come to you, Ms. Smuts, in a second.
And then the other example.
All right. No. Let's stick with this one example here, because were they not advising what would be legally sound?
In fact, they went beyond. They should have simply struck it down and said the legislature must come up with a different law.
A legally acceptable law.
Yes, a legally acceptable law, that is correct, but not to determine the nature of the institution that had to be created by the state.
Ms. Smuts, you wanted to come in here. Is there anything wrong, particularly in this case here, surrounding the scorpions? The abolition of the scorpions?
That majority judgment was certainly a creative one, but let's not forget that under our constitutional order, and it's the separation of powers is the point I wish to get back to.
Yeah.
It has been authoritatively said by our previous Chief Justice that each branch has its assigned role, but the Constitution does contemplate some encroachment of the one upon the other, and therefore you have to expect some tension. May I say, though, Mr. Gwala, I'm actually shocked to hear my friend the Deputy Minister, and a Happy New Year to you also, Ngoako.
New Year to you,
I'm actually
Dean.
quite surprised to hear you reassert the view that the separation of powers is unacceptable. What you wrote was that this constituted a concession by the ANC, as did the adoption of a Bill of Rights and the right to equality. And you have, since that time, been repudiated by two leading persons. When I raised this issue in the House, we have, Mr. Gwala had a skirmish on this matter between the two of us, and we look forward to a debate on the matter this year. This is, in fact, then round one of our debate.
Yes.
But during the skirmish in the House last year, the Justice Minister repudiated the Deputy Minister's position that the ANC did not embrace the separation of powers. And then, of course, Joel Netshitenzi wrote at length on this matter and said that the ANC has always accepted the separation of the powers as an achievement of human civilization, and without referring to Ngoako by name, said it's false to say the principle was a compromise, that the tension between the branches is normal, and that it should not lead to the questioning of the very principle of separation of power. Now, what I'd like to ask the Deputy Minister is this. To me, it's very striking that the attacks, if you wish, on the courts have come from persons Blade Nzimande, Gwede Mantashe, who are associated with one faction in the ANC. In fact, I read that they are the people on the slate, for the Zuma slate for Mangaung. Would it be, because my concern is that the Deputy Minister has turned himself into an anti-constitutionalist, because he says that the Constitution empties the executive and the legislature of power, immigrates power away from them and into the courts, where the old order has built a fortified front line.
All right.
That makes him an anti-constitutionalist. The persons who have repudiated him are constitutionalists. Is that what we're looking at, Deputy Minister?
Is that what we're looking at, Deputy
No,
Minister?
we are not looking at a rejection of the Constitution.
Are we not?
What we are looking at is all the spheres of government abiding by the principles and the rules that the Constitution dictates we should observe. So when one sphere begin to take over the functions of another sphere, that sphere is threatening the constitutional democracy that we have.
Well, let's go back. Sorry.
It's the national executive of which you are part of, which is currently emptying the executive in your old province, Limpopo, of power under Section 100. It is the national executive which is migrating power out of the executive in Limpopo. It's not the courts.
All right, we'll get to that point in a minute, because you start off, Deputy Minister, by talking of the fatal concessions by the ANC. I'm not sure whether that refers then to the Constitution as it is today.
Yes. No, that refers basically to the economic regime that we have in this country. And it's very interesting that all commentators have decided to focus on the courts, not on the economic situation in this country that I'm talking about. And I'm saying that Constitution, our Constitution, was a compromise in the sense that it allowed the apartheid racial economy to stay in place. And that's what it's all about.
But are you suggesting that the ANC then is regretting that there was this concession, that it is regretting coming into this agreement, and that it is cornered perhaps by what it authored?
You see, if you can change economic relations in this country in favor of the black majority, which is a fundamental demand of the struggle for liberation, then you are threatening the very Constitution yourself by so doing.
If indeed you are regretting the Constitution as it is, are you therefore suggesting that the ANC may and should in the near future then change the Constitution or change certain sections thereof?
Well, the Constitution, we are changing it all the time, as a matter of fact. We keep on amending it, and if the situation should so demand, there should be no reason why we should not continue with the practice that is in place in any event.
But there's a very great difference, if I may, Mr. Gwala.
Yeah, go ahead.
Between the kind of constitutional amendments that we have engaged upon. They simply augment the constitutional order. There's a difference between that and attacking the Constitution at its root and foundations, which is what you do when you question or attack the separation of the powers on the basis that there's too much intrusion of one arm of the state's turf on another. And the irony of everything Ngoako is saying is, if you'll allow me, is, I mean, it was the ANC, for example, which pushed hardest for the inclusion of the socio-economic rights in the Bill of Rights. If I may say, the DP, we wanted them, but on the basis that conditions for survival must be ensured. The problem with the socio-economics is precisely there, justiciability and enforceability. I mean, if ever there's a case where you are inviting a court to rule on the kind of issues which are traditionally those of the executive, budgetary issues, policy, that is it. And it was, in fact, the ANC's position that should be included in a justiciable Bill of Rights. And if we are serious about improving the conditions of the poor in this country, then the rulings of the Constitutional Court, for example, in respect of health, housing, and so forth, have greatly assisted economically. You see, I mean, I don't buy the argument that the constitutional order in any way stands in the way of the economic improvement of the conditions of all South Africans. I mean, it is precisely what the Limpopo executive got up to that has ruined the life chances and the economy of that province. I mean, it is the ANC government's failure to effect economic improvements for all except the serially enriched BEE cadres under our previous president. Those are your problems. Your problem does not lie in the Constitution.
All right, let's allow the Deputy Minister to develop the point then about how the Constitution can frustrate the implementation of economic changes.
When there are, for instance, in the country, it's okay to have and agree with the NC in session and the Constitution regarding the justifiable Bill of Rights. I agree with that.
Good.
But if applied in a manner that does not assist transformation, it can sabotage the state.